Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Intuitive channel. I'm Ann Angelo Webb, and our usual focus is on supporting animals and their caregivers. And tonight is really no different in that we have to think about how can we give animals a voice in every way possible. So those of us who cherish the bond between humans and animals must recognize that understanding the root causes of violence towards both humans and animals is essential to figuring out ways to help prevent future violence and protect the innocent. Our esteemed guests tonight, Dr. Ann Burgess, Dr. Katherine Ramsland, and Dr. Gary Brucato, have dedicated their expertise to understanding violence against humans and have contributed significantly to understanding its relationship to violence against animals. They have gained invaluable insights from human victims of violence and by direct access to the minds of many violent criminals. Together, this panel also forms the extraordinary coalition, as they are all consultants with the Cold Case Foundation, whose mission is to raise public awareness and create partnerships to assist and provide law enforcement with whatever resources are needed to bring closure to unsolved cases. Our panel members have become sought-after featured guests on major media outlets, and tonight we have an incredible opportunity to explore these topics and also talk about early warning signs, how to recognize potential indicators of future violence in children, and possible intervention strategies for children and adults with these different behaviors that we're going to talk about. And join us as we delve into the shadows, focusing on shining a light on the path toward, dare I say, possible hope for change. I do want to mention a trigger warning. Some may find this content disturbing, so I encourage you to prepare yourself emotionally beforehand, and if you believe that you will find the discussion too traumatizing, you may choose not to watch. Before we begin our discussion, or traumatizing at all, don't watch. Before we begin our discussion, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit more about each of our guests. And I'm just going to check yes, I'm not getting anybody telling me they can't hear me. I wanted to just check on that. Because we do have some people in the chat, and we'll say hello in just a moment. But I want to introduce our guest. So I'm just going to go through an order of, not in any particular order, but acquaint you a little bit with the people that we have here on the panel. Some of you are familiar with them, but some of you who usually come to watch things about animals may not be. So there is much more on their list of accomplishments than I have even time to mention in this introduction, but please check out the description afterward below and go and look at their books and other publications and the links I have there for them. So let me start with Dr. Ann Burgess. She is an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse. She is the author of an extensive body of work, including best-selling books such as A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Many of you may be familiar with the Netflix series Mindhunter. Dr. Burgess is the model for the character of Dr. Wendy Carr, as Dr. Burgess played a significant role as a consultant with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in putting their early criminal profiling efforts. Dr. Burgess worked with the FBI Academy Special Agents to study serial offenders and the links between child abuse, juvenile delinquency, and subsequent violent behavior. As a distinguished author, researcher, and clinician, Dr. Burgess is a trailblazer in forensic nursing, having significantly impacted the understanding of trauma research and victim advocacy. She is a professor at Boston College, teaching courses in victimology, forensic science, forensic mental health, case studies in forensics, and forensic science lab. And Dr. Burgess has been given the honor of Living Legend by the American Academy of Nursing. Dr. Katherine Ramsland is a seasoned professor, forensic psychologist, and renowned expert in the field of criminal justice. She is the inaugural director for the Center of Teaching Excellence, Professor Emerita at DeSalle University, and Dr. Ramsland is the author of more than 1,500 articles and 68 books, including How to Catch a Killer, The Psychology of Death Investigations, and The Mind of a Murderer. She worked with the BTK serial killer Dennis Rader on his autobiography, and Dr. Ramsland currently pens the Shadowboxing blog on Psychology Today and teaches seminars on extreme offenders to death investigators and homicide detectives. Dr. Ramsland trains law enforcement professionals and speaks internationally about forensic psychology, investigative psychology, jury dynamics, suicidology, and extreme offenders. She has also assisted and co-written books with former FBI profilers such as John Douglas. On his book, The Cases That Haunt Us. She also co-authored The Real World of a Forensic Scientist with Elaine M. Pagliaro and renowned forensic criminalist Henry C. Lee. Dr. Gary Brucato. Dr. Gary Brucato is an accomplished clinical psychologist, researcher, and expert in early psychosis, severe violence, and personality disorders. He co-authored with Dr. Michael Stone, who recently left behind an esteemed legacy, the book The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. He has published over 100 articles for peer-reviewed journals on psychotic illness and violence, 2 books and multiple book chapters, and contributes articles to Psychology Today. Dr. Brucato is regularly consulted by investigators, families, and clinicians seeking his expertise. He is in full-time private practice in New York City, conducts psychological and forensic evaluations, provides expert testimony in criminal and civil courts, and co-created the Columbia Mass Murder Database. Dr. Brucato is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Victor Petrecka on forensic research. Welcome, everyone, to the show.
Good to be here.
Exhausted listening to that. I'm so tired.
Thank you.
I'm so glad people are still here hanging in. Let me just check into the chat. Hello, everyone. Hi, Missing Stolen Animals from Ireland group. It's good to see you all here. I see that people are very excited. You've been following the work of our 3 guests, and you want to say a big thank you for hosting this panel. Well, I'm very grateful that they're here. Hi, Miss Aries. Thank you for being here. And I hope there's not an echo. I'm suddenly hearing. Is anyone else picking up an echo?
Yes, I hear it.
All of a sudden, and then it stops. Okay. All right. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you. Yes, we have to be concerned about the kids and what we can do, maybe. So we're going to talk about that. And okay, yeah. So I'm sure with the Missing Stolen Animals Ireland group, through the work you do in your Facebook group, you've been witness to different accounts of cruelty and violence towards, sorry about that being up high, dogs and cats and horses. As these cases increase daily, we must look at the link you mentioned. Yeah, so important. So we can ask questions. Feel free in the chat. But let's move along and let's go on. I just want to lay some foundation here and ask the group to clarify for everyone the meaning behind the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder versus psychopathology, and just to provide any thoughts that you have about the fact that we have this sort of division about those terms.
Do you mean psychopathy? And
what did I say?
Psychopathology.
Oh, sorry, psychopathy. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I can address that if you'd like. I wrote about that whole section on how to distinguish those in the New Evil. So you want to understand that psychopathy, which is a constellation of personality traits that have to do with a kind of amorality, a tendency to be kind of bored and sensation seeking, a glibness interpersonally, taking advantage of others without much remorse, being charming, etc., was described. I mean, historically, there are people who talked about these features, but it was really systematically described by Keckley in a book called The Mask of Sanity, and then described more fully by Hare, Robert Hare, who was a prominent Canadian psychologist, and he developed the famous checklist, the psychopathy checklist. What wound up happening, really, and I mean the short version of it, is that when the DSM was being written, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there was such a movement to make medical and objective diagnoses that they removed the aspects of psychopathy that are not really objectively observed but are felt by a person. And as a consequence, a lot of the key features of psychopathy that people like Hare had identified were sort of set aside. And you wind up with a somewhat watered down version of a condition, so that people who have antisocial personality disorder can run the gamut, right, from very high functioning, kind of politicians or lawyers or people like that, or people who are engaging in things like knocking over the deli and holding, killing somebody who's a witness, etc., all the way up to the most extreme psychopaths who engage in torture repeatedly, or murder. And it's a very problematic diagnosis for that reason, I think. So that I think when you look at the personality structures of these people, you want to envision a spectrum that kind of runs from narcissism through to varying degrees of psychopathy into ultimately sadism, which I think we're going to be touching on a lot
Mhm.
in talking about animal abuse. I think it's really sadism that you start thinking about hurting animals.
Okay. And so maybe just to start out, what are some identifiers that people might recognize if they just had someone in their life day to day, someone they worked with that might be somewhere on this scale or spectrum? Um, how might you recognize, like, are there certain red flags that people could help identify them or make them stand out, even when they're not doing something, obviously sadistic or just, or not at all? Is it?
No, deceptive, manipulative, callous, without remorse, unmotivated cruelty, things like that. Breaking promises.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And what have you found in your work and in your studies? And of course, I'm kind of putting these questions out to anybody to answer for in any whoever wants to jump in. But what portion of those that might have antisocial personality disorder, or whatever we want to say, um, would be, what estimate would you have those that would act out violently?
Well, I know that they've done some studies. I can only speak to more from a developmental standpoint. I find it helpful to look at. Are you talking about a child who is, say, just school age, or a teenager, or a young adult, etc.? And when does it start? I think that's kind of important to look at. And what is it? What is it that you're looking at, and where do you begin to get some complaints? I can think of a case that I'll tell you at the end who which serial killer it was. But what would a parent do, say, who comes home every day after work and has these lovely fish in a fish tank, and finds a few of them up, floating at the top of the water, um, and cleans it up. Then the next day it's the same thing. So again, that's a very simple kind of a example of when does somebody get concerned, and that isn't even looking at a cat or a dog, or the other kinds of things they can do, but just fish. Somebody's killing the fish, and how do you find out, and how do you investigate, and who do you go to? What should a parent do?
Right. And that's definitely
I,
something we want to talk about. So, oh, go ahead, Dr. Brucato.
He
no,
probably
I was just gonna add that we want to remember that antisocial personality or psychopathy, whichever we're going to discuss, these are things that would really date all the way back to childhood. A personality disorder doesn't just erupt when a person is 18, right? It's going to be there a long time. And when we ask the question about predicting violence, you have to ask what kind of violence. If you're talking about serial homicide, well, you can't do much better than to ask the people here. I mean, Anne, for example, was very instrumental in the project that helped to make household knowledge out of some of the childhood antecedents. And one of the key things we'll see is fantasy. A lot of these people are experimenters and are curious about living things. And we can start to see um, hurting animals, for example, out of a strange intellectual curiosity about what's inside of them or what happens to them when you hurt them. And then you get the type that's more interested in seeing it suffer. But the point is, and I think it would be really interesting to hear Anne and Catherine talk about this from some of their encounters, people who've done this, is that there's a kind of projection onto other people or animals or both, feelings of having been made to feel humiliated or out of control or so forth, and then so it's all about a kind of assertion of domination, control, manipulation that seems to have its roots in childhood. And then as a person ages and I guess goes through more stressors and gets older, we finally see this explosion and this escalation into acting out those fantasies. So that's like the pathway to that kind of violence. But then we see psychopathic people committing all kinds of other violence, but there isn't necessarily a serial killing component. That's why I think there's a very wide spectrum. And Catherine and Ann, I think you'd agree. I mean, we've seen the whole gamut of cruel behaviors. One final point I'll make is that it's very characteristic of people who are psychopathic to have what Hare called um, criminal versatility, which really means that you don't just hear about them doing one thing wrong. When you hear about somebody being a serial killer, you might find out that they were also writing bad checks, robbing banks, looking at illegal pornography, hitting a spout, etc. There's just a whole array because the amorality is so all encompassing.
Yeah, and when in just doing research for this topic, I was looking at the link. Coalition has a really good list of sort of statistics. I'm not going to sit here and read all of them, but it does talk about 100% of sexual homicide offenders had a history of cruelty towards animals. 70% of all animal abusers have committed at least one other criminal offense, and almost 40% have committed violent crimes against people. But they talk a lot about witnessing violence in the home as children, and that being a major issue. So I know that we're also kind of getting into the younger years version when we talk about maybe conduct disorder and what kids fall into that category and the callous unemotional traits. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that. What in detail? I know we touched on it, but what goes on? Where do things get crossed? Where it becomes, let me, I've seen these things in my home. I've had trauma in my life. At what point does it cross over to I'm going to take this out on an animal?
Well, the obvious one is that the animals, the more helpless creature in the home, and that maybe the kids have been abused, they have nowhere to turn, so the animal is the easy target, and they take out their frustrations on the animal. That sometimes can happen, or they are beginning to have fantasies. They're not sure about where to go with it, and they know the animal's not going to talk. So if the witness survives, the witness isn't going to say anything to anybody. So it's fairly easy for them to turn to the animal to do that. Or they're doing experiments on the animal, like Dennis Rader would. He liked bondage, and he would tie up dogs to watch them struggle. He didn't think that was abusive. He didn't think he was doing anything to them that was negative, but he wanted to see their terror because it made him feel more powerful.
Yeah. Well, the Iceman did that with cats, if I remember. He would tie their tails together and then see what they would do. So that the ability to orchestrate, if you will, their own little sadistic scenario is, and they get a lot of pleasure out of that. I think that's the point I think you're trying to ask us about, and is the when does it become a something that should be reported or something that you should be concerned about. I read some statistics where you can have some of this is quote normal. I'm just quoting. I don't know what study they did, but that a lot of kids will do things to animals, and in the service of trying to, I don't think they think it's abusive, but to get a reaction out of the animal, and in some way that seems to get a reaction out of them.
Yeah.
We all know that the McDonald triad, that was supposedly so predictive of committing these kinds of offenses, fire starting, bedwetting, and animal torture. I saw recently a pretty exhaustive meta-analysis that tried to ask the question of whether that actually predicts anything. And it turns out that it does only if you have two of them, two or more of them. It's not adequate to have only one. So the I guess the clinical takeaway from that would be you wouldn't be horribly alarmed by hurting an animal alone. But if you're additionally doing one of those other things, then you start getting a sense of a disinhibited, angry person who, is asserting power in this way. I think, Anne and Catherine, would you agree? There have been cases of offenders doing this even as small children. I mean, children and teenagers. There's no clear time it starts, right? Because I'm aware of cases where they were 6, 7, 8 years old doing things like that, and I'm certainly aware of teenagers who start doing it. Anyone know an average age? I've seen it all over the map.
I don't know. And I think part of the problem is the kids admitting to doing it. They either have to be caught or they have to voluntarily admit. But I think a lot of them would keep that secret.
Hmm. In the case of the boy that in Michigan that was recently convicted for the mass shooting,
Crumbly.
the Embry case, Crumbly. The parents are, in some hot water for, being involved in him getting a firearm. One of the things that I found very haunting about his story was that he had reportedly brought the decapitated head of a bird into school in a small jar and left it in the bathroom, I think, for other students to see. And there's an incident which has not yet been tied to him, it may never be, where the children were playing in the schoolyard, and then there was a thud, and the severed head of a deer came rolling off of the roof and just sort of plopped into the yard. And, if he is responsible for that, in addition to the bird, I think, again, you start to see, this incredible, provocative, haunting kind of expression of anger and of a person who's trying to say, don't mess with me, because it's really very creepy. But I also think that there's an oddness to some of these people because there is that detached experimental quality. Some of these people will talk about dissecting animals simply to like the way a scientist would,
Yeah.
that they keep notebooks or record, this is what happened when I did this to this animal, and then they apply it. They try to apply it later to people. And but what I just wanted to stick in here is that there also sometimes is a very clear pattern where we can see a child being abused, and then they go out and hurt animals, and then they may apply that to a human being, and you sort of watch the pattern. And in fact, a little later, I'll talk about a case where that very clearly happened. But I think the key may be that a lot of them are physically abused themselves. Anne and Catherine, would you say there does appear to be some relationship between corporal punishment, humiliation, being physically abused or sexually abused, and then hurting the bodies of these animals? But it
Well,
may not
I,
be a clear
I think
correlation.
the Crumbly case is interesting because that's more a case of neglect and reactive
Mhm,
anger. Whereas, I mean, the parents had horses. It's not like they were
mhm,
animal abusers themselves. They obviously loved their horses because they were out with the horse rather than their son in some of these occasions. So that's an interesting and complex case. I don't know that he was abused so much as the neglect made him angry and
mhm.
he's reacting.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
The other thing I think it matters as who is the animal. Is the animal a pet of theirs? Is the animal belong to a
Mm.
Yes.
neighbor? Are they trying to harass the neighbor and do things? We certainly have examples of that. Um, or is it just a stray? All of those things can need to be put into for if you're going to be looking at the impact. Um,
Yeah,
And Hunt.
agree. Because Raider had a dog that he loved, but he would hang cats in the barn, approved by his grandmother, who didn't like cats. So that to him was not abuse. It was that's what she wanted, And yet he did certainly have feelings for a pet dog, several pet dogs that he had.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
There
this
are
kind of.
also serial killers who talk about that it was a kind of a bonding ritual, something that made them feel virile when their father, for example, would take them out hunting. That hunting is something else that figures into for a lot of these guys is that it may not be enough to just have an animal in front of you that you're abusing, but there's the excitement and the thrill of running after it and having it be helpless and trapping it, and then you start to see that played out later with humans. So I think that's another. I mean, this is not to disparage people, everyone who hunts. I simply mean that in these cases, it can take on a very dark meaning.
Hmm. Right, and I see some people in the chat are kind of related to what you're saying there.
Mhm.
If an adult in the home kicks and beats an animal, the child sees this as okay. Then, as they get older, could it move from animals to humans? They're wondering.
Well, it could. It doesn't necessarily. I mean, one thing we do see that just because kids are abusive to animals in their teen years doesn't mean they'll go on to keep doing that in their adult years. So they do often outgrow it. But so, yes, they're asking, could it be? Yes, it could be. I don't know what the percentage would be, though.
Okay. And also the questions coming here. Would it be helpful to teach children from an early age in schools? It seems, especially in Ireland, children learn from peers how to treat animals.
Well, I know it's some places when you're trying to treat juveniles who have committed really aggressive acts that they to try to teach them more compassion and so forth. They see if they can care for animals. I don't know of any specific program, but I remember hearing, and I always thought that was quite interesting because they could watch that with supervision, and if they saw the person. It sounds like it's more boys than girls. This is not necessarily. This is more gender related to males. Um,
Yeah.
so, but is the question: what if a parent or somebody in the home witnesses, um,
If
or is
the
it?
child witnesses an adult in the home.
Right. Well, that's complicated because if the adult is doing it and can say, "Well, I'm just making the dog behave," or whatever the issue is, it and doesn't explain it to the child, sure, that could be an issue
Right.
of
Yeah.
repeating.
Mm-hmm. Um, well, I'm wondering what you do think about. I mean, I know that there are these programs now that they're training programs, they kind of call them. They have all these different types, but they're all sort of the same design, focused on children who seem to have these issues early on, where you're focusing more on warmth and reward based parenting and teaching this is the way to parent as opposed to the opposite sort of punishment based, because there seems to be some information that there's these kids, if they have this, if they really have, as children, they're going to maybe become adults who would have maybe ASPD, that they don't respond to uh, taking things away or, negatives as far as like punishment based. Have you seen that in your work, that there's in the people you've spoken to and think they don't respond to that
I
the
think
same
you
way some
might be
kids?
talking about children at risk for becoming adult psychopaths who might,
Yeah.
in fact, be born with a certain brain condition that involves callousness, emotional
Mm-hmm.
blunting, um, and not responding to any kind of behavioral controls. So I think that might be what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's difficult and requires, I think, very intensive one-on-one kind of training. But whether that would end up becoming animal abuse, I mean, it's certainly not a given that it would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering, from the individuals that any of you have spoken to, does that um, kind of ring a bell from what they've talked about, like just not really getting punishment based? And I don't mean punishment even necessarily like hitting and things like that, but non-reward based responses to things that these kids have done wrong, or instead of it being like a positive, like, oh, you get rewards for doing good, instead they're getting in trouble for doing sorry, I'm going to echo again for some reason. I don't know why. But does that ring a bell from the individuals that you've spoken to, that it just didn't work for them? It didn't.
Well, I've had some experience where a teacher will get concerned about a child's behavior in the classroom and will want to have some kind of consultation on it. That's one way. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. But
Well, I mean, more like it seems like there seems to be some indication that kids who maybe are showing signs that maybe down the line as adults they would be growing up to have what would be called antisocial personality disorder. It's kids with maybe they're being diagnosed with conduct disorder, for instance, that they respond best to reward based, and they kind of don't get uh, the traditional form of, like, for some reason the word's slipping my mind, not negative, but when you
Like reinforcement or
negative yeah, like
Punishment.
well, it's
punishment, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's important to remember that when we're disciplined, um, what's really happening is a fear response in the brain. It's like an amygdala brain reaction, right? And then we sort of it imprints on us. It says like, don't touch that stove again, And those of us who, if you have a kind of functioning conscience or morality, moral compass, you might also learn by empathy and kind of seeing that or compassion or had an effect on another person that hurt them. But imagine an individual that doesn't really have an appropriate fear reaction, and that same blunted emotional aspect makes it difficult for them to feel guilt or empathy or compassion for another person. How would a person like that learn? Well, they would learn basically from a totally transactional relationship with somebody where if you want this, this is what you're going to do. If you don't want this to happen, this is what you're going to do. And you see that I've seen it more in interventions that are designed for offenders, where it's like, how do we get them to behave in a prison setting? And even in psychotherapy, for example, when it's utilized in that setting, one of the things you learn is that they learn to mimic the compassionate insights that the therapist teaches them, and then to use them transactionally to get what they want, like to sort of act kind to get privileges, or to seem like you've gotten healthier or gained insight. And so I think it becomes very transactional because it's just not going to be about fear. And that's the whole thing. In fact, for some of these guys, getting in trouble and chaos and so forth can actually be the closest they come to getting really excited.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can almost take on a masochistic quality with some of them. Oh, I almost got caught engaging in some highly sexualized, inappropriate. We certainly saw that with Raider, Catherine. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about, but I think there is that quality of drawing your excitement from the ever increasing risk taking, partly as a way of dealing with that numbness, that shrieking numbness that they experience about everything. Because imagine walking through life unafraid and not really caring much about
Mm-hmm.
anything is a difficult inner experience.
Yeah. You know, I guess I'm wondering, what do we think is, or where are you all at, and what your research as far as what leads to this? Is it just the brain abnormality combined with the trauma? Like, what are you finding is the pattern, or is it just all over the place?
Well, there's no formula about any of this, and I think each case has its own developmental trajectory, its own triggers, its own influences, and so to try to box it into some kind of is it nature or nurture? It just doesn't really serve any purpose in terms of really treating somebody. What we want to be able to do is see what are the early signs in any particular individual, and how that, what kinds of resources do we have to be able to intervene in an early point. It doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really much matter what's the percentage of nature and nurture. It really matters what are we doing with these individual cases.
Someone and that makes sense.
Yeah,
They're
I,
asking.
I would just add that it's very hard when you want to get at what the thought is going on in the person's mind that was activating the behavior. And that's the hard part, is how do you find that out before the behavior happens?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Exactly. And there's a shame because some of these guys, if they had been treated a little better by the world, you wonder if their sensation-seeking, fearless kind of quality might have been used pro-socially. This might have been
Mm-hmm.
the kind of person who would, hurl themselves on a grenade to save a platoon, as opposed to somebody that needs to go out and level the playing field because, people have hurt them. In fact, all across history, people with psychopathic traits have been leaders and people that have been very sexy and attractive and powerful and all that. And I think that's because if the person's on your side, all that fearlessness and so forth would be very strong and make you feel safe. It's only when it's utilized in an antisocial way that it's terrifying to have a human predator like that, right? But we forget that those traits can be utilized in different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you see that sometimes. But what's even more confusing is you're going to have two kids that grow up in the same house, exposed to the same stuff, and one becomes psychopathic and the other one is almost pro-social, and then
Yeah.
you don't know how to make sense out of it. And I think, to Catherine's point, there is a growing body of evidence where you could do research like this. There is a growing body of evidence that some of these people actually have brain abnormalities. There are different sizes to the amygdala, the frontal lobe, the connections between them, sometimes even an absence. There can be, and some of them have been head injured and then completely change after they have those injuries. And I think that's a very uncomfortable model because it makes people think that you're calling it a sickness or you're taking away the moral question. But I think when we start applying that kind of stuff, we miss the point that these are not mystical people, or like, they're not walking around like the devil in red tights. They're within the realm of what could happen to a human. I mean, wouldn't you say, Anne and Catherine, that's almost what's scariest about them?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, and we have some people in the chat. Yeah, I think you're asking about if there's an animal abuse registry in their states. I think actually,
Oh,
they have in different states. Um, I d- they're asking if you know if there's any in your state. If this is an important tool. This is someone in Ireland asking if this is an important tool to prevent further cruelties to both people and animals. Um,
well, there's no mandated reporting even for clinicians that I'm aware of. We're not mandated to report child abuse, of course,
right.
things like that. But animal abuse, no. To my knowledge, do you know, Anne and Catherine, have you ever heard of mandated animal abuse reporting?
No, and I even looked up on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, whether it was listed. And I think really, as I got into how many of our school shooters and other things have a
Yeah.
history of this, it really should be listed there. I don't know why it couldn't be, because that's such um, I think it's a red flag. But I don't know of anything, it's certainly not mandated that I know of, unless well, wait a minute. I guess they have some on, you can't do uh, some fights, rooster fights or something. You can't, what is that one? Uh,
Cockfighting and
Animal
things like that. Yeah.
Oh,
fights.
yeah.
Yeah, I think at that level, but that would be for profit.
Unfortunately,
Well,
we've had this discussion on this show, and I am blanking on that. And I know that that it's definitely been advocated for, and I know we've had a couple people who have talked about it, and I can't remember. There's some there's something to that where they're trying to get something going at the very least, and but I just can't remember. We talked. I had somebody on in December from Animal Victory. You might want to check that episode because I think we talked about it there. But and what was I going to say about that? If you, I know that I've gotten. Oh, something came into my email that it was talking about, for instance, vets. It was a conference that was coming up and talking about this very thing, that potentially having veterinarians and some other people in the animal world become mandated reporters for animals, and it completely makes. I mean, it's ridiculous that they're not. I mean, it's crazy. These animals, especially with vets, like they're in your care, just like a doctor who would have a child come into their care. Of course, they should be mandated. I mean, I don't.
Well, I think it's even more horrifying when you realize that we're talking about the physical abuse or killing of animals, but there are also sexual abuses of animals.
Yeah.
And, and these are things that, offenders will talk about. And that's like, it's hard to even say out loud. It's so
Mm-hmm.
disturbing. I will tell you from the mass murder database we did that animal assault was actually extremely rare in people that commit mass murder, which I don't think would be too surprising,
Mm-hmm.
because the vast majority of people who commit mass murder are not really psychopathic or motivated by sexual fantasy or any of that kind of stuff. It's a very different kind of person. But there are about 11.78% of mass murderers who are actually serial killers. They've killed previously or later. For example, Dennis Rader, that Catherine has known and written about, is a mass murderer in the Otero case, for example, is a mass murderer who is also a serial killer. And he is someone who assaulted animals. He's in our database as a mass murderer. But so there seems to be to me, in my work, there is definitely a closer relationship with the personality structure of a serial killer than a mass murderer or a spree killer or someone of that type. In fact, I think it's almost a hallmark a little more. Does that jive, Anne and Catherine, with your sense of things? That it would be less common in a mass murderer to
Yeah,
assault
although I
animals?
will say mass murderers often have rigid personalities, and when you have an animal around that doesn't obey, they're going to go after it. I mean,
Well, that's
I
true. That's true. But I mean,
Mm.
the history of playing out fantasies in childhood
no,
on
I
animals
think
and things like
fantasy
that. I
and
mean,
animal abuse are two different things because you can
yes,
be abusive to an animal without it being a sexual thing.
exactly. I think where it takes on a fantasy element, a sexual element, it's more a hallmark of a serial killer type. In fact, I think you said, and that you saw 100%, that the stats said 100% of sexually
That's what
motivated
it
serial killers had
says.
some history of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would actually want to see that database. That doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, and I'd like to
Yeah.
see, it has a link to where the reference was, and for some reason that page didn't, it got cut off on my printer, so I can't even tell you what the study was that they got it from, but um, it's the Link Coalition. I think
I
that's
think
the.
I have the article with the citation. I can send it
Oh, okay,
to
yeah.
Catherine and later. Yeah.
Yeah, and they actually, the link referenced you, Dr. Brucato, because you maybe tell people a little bit about your In the New Evil, the um,
Oh,
people who may not be familiar with that book and the
well,
relations.
it's going to be a little difficult to do the quick version of this, so this is all I'll say. Michael Stone, my mentor, had, I think, pretty famously created a gradation for how shocking and excessive and cruel acts were. And so he conceptualized evil, a word that is commonly used when people see these acts, not so much in a religious way, but as a term having to do with the excess and the way we react emotionally to the act. And so he had the sense that if we used people's reaction to it as a kind of a guideline, you can see that some acts are certainly worse than others. Killing someone out of jealousy is certainly lower on the scale than repeatedly torturing people and killing them, that kind of thing. And so I think what the link talked about in the article they did was simply that they were pleased that when I edited for the new evil, I did an edit of Michael's scale. We built it up. I talked to him about including animal abuses as shockingly cruel acts that should be included in category 16, or if there's a sexual kind of torture of animals, to include it in 17, which in Michael's scale was just about excessively cruel acts or sexualized acts against humans. And they were really very happy about that because they thought that, obviously it shed a light on how a lot of these people can demonstrate cruelty like that. And so that's what it's about.
Okay, yeah, definitely. It's great that that was included. And I have some questions here. Do you think, Paul Gabius, do you think that lack of morality can be an innate condition based on a myriad of developmental factors? Complex
We
question.
would win the
Too
Nobel
broad for
Prize
me.
if we had the answer to that one. Yeah,
Too broad for me.
yeah, it's too
Um,
broad.
and also asking, how does your experience with these criminals affect your view of capital punishment? Kind of a different, little off topic, but if you'd like to answer,
And
you don't have to
Yeah,
if you don't
I
want to, but
prefer not to talk
you
about
don't
that.
have to.
Yeah.
And also, okay, yeah. So you're campaigning for an all island animal cruelty registry in Ireland. Yeah, I would.
Oh, well, I think
I think
that's
that's a great
pretty
idea. Yeah,
reasonable. Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
an interesting thing to study a little further. It sort of makes me think, and maybe in our research at Boston College, we can take a look at how many of our guys were doing some of this stuff. I mean, like for example, one of the things a lot of people I think would be interested in is the relationship between domestic violence and animal abuse. And having a look at the literature, I wasn't too satisfied with the answer. I think it's not really very clear. Do either of you know, Anne or Catherine, if there's any really strong evidence about those two things being linked in any way?
What do linked? What do you mean? Like
Like,
causally?
is one
What?
predictive of the other? Is domestic violence related to
I haven't seen.
perpetrating domestic violence against a partner related to animal abuse? I mean, it
Well,
seems like it would be, but is it shown in literature?
the literature I've seen shows that if there's domestic abuse in the home, there's a higher likelihood of kids potentially abusing animals because of the role model aspect to it and the
Mm,
instability of the home, the emotionality of the home. But in terms of,
mm.
I don't. Do you mean like somebody who's being abused, like the wife or husband, is now going to turn that on the animal? I don't.
That
I
kind
don't
of
know no
thing.
literature like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a little weak what we know about it in those areas. What do you think, Ann?
yeah. I haven't. I tried to take a quick look at some of the literature. I didn't see anything that would speak to that. It's more of what I think Catherine said, and more about if the child has been abused, that there's a more likelihood that they may abuse an animal, and that makes sense because they can be recreating it or whatever you want to call it as a way. But I do think that I was rather interested in how many of just a list. What I just Googled in animal abuse and serial and murders or something like that. A lot came up. The one that was most outstanding is an international case. It was the Anders Behring Breivik over in where is
Oh,
that? Over in
Norway.
Norway. What he
Norway.
said, he would torment rats and put bumblebees in water so he could watch them drown. And neighbors had made it clear to keep their children had to stay away from him, just don't come anywhere near him. And I think what that speaks to is that he would watch them die, even these bumblebees, I guess, and that the neighbors knew about it, the kids knew about it. So that's a pretty clear example, I think, of someone who probably over time there's certainly things in his background, but Gary, your suggestion to do a little study would be really quite interesting. It probably wouldn't be that
Yeah.
hard, but to get the information about what they did, I mean, it evidently is there. If we want to,
Right.
and all of the school shooters, I was really surprised at how many. You've got Michael Carney, you've got Nicholas Cruz, You've got Andy
Mhm.
Golden. All of these shooters have done things, and it's sometimes with their own pet.
Skip Kinkle,
Yeah.
another one.
So there's got to be a
Yeah, there
difference.
there are certainly a lot anecdotally, but when we did
Yeah.
the large scale
Yeah,
database, we found it to be pretty rare. But I think that there has to be something to it that we, that since there's so many anecdotal cases,
yeah,
I
well,
think the case it was really going around in my mind when we were invited to do this. And I mean, we just don't have the time to tell this whole story, but I'll give you the short version. Is there's a very infamous offender called Gary Heidnik, Philadelphia based. And Gary Heidnik had an extremely cruel and emasculating father who would do things like, because he was a bedwetter, and the father felt that he had to humiliate Gary Heidnik to get him to stop wetting the bed. And he would do things like dangle him outside the window by his ankles, or put his wet sheets or underwear on a flagpole outside the window so that everyone would laugh. And what happened is, and I think this is where it's so interesting, is that to start to get a feeling of taking it to getting his sort of sense of himself back, he started hanging animals, cats and other animals from trees. So you have a kid who's being hanged by his father out the window, now hanging animals. And then what happens with him, long story short, is that he, after a whole series of separations from women that he had been involved with and children he had sired, he gets this $1 million idea, he thinks, that he's going to create a hole in the basement, a pit in the basement of his home, and he's going to get intellectually disabled women from a home that are going to live in the pit by force and sire him a line of children who are totally devoted to him for life. So now he can't lose anyone anymore, right? And he winds up torturing one of the women to death by hanging her up, hanging just like that. And then when he's ultimately caught, he tries to hang himself in prison, in jail. That he tried to commit suicide by hanging himself. So I always thought there was something about that narrative arc where it's like a hot potato, right? Of like dad abuses the kid takes it on the animal, he takes it out on an adult, and then finally it comes back around to the original object of abuse. And I think that's just a beautiful illustration of where the animal torment, the animal torture just is an enormous signifier. And think about if somebody had said to him, "What's the meaning of doing this? What are you trying to say?" That's what always bothers me about these narratives about these guys is where was the person who came in and said, "Why are you doing that?" I think we saw that with Jeffrey Dahmer's dad when he was shocked to find things like Jeffrey Dahmer putting a crow in a box until he no longer hears the squawk because it's died in the box, or things like that. I mean, at some point, the father gets horrified and kind of talks to him about it. But that's the piece that has always bugged me, and the intervention by someone who says, and Catherine, haven't you seen that to be missing in a lot of these narratives? I mean, someone asking, what is this about? Why are you doing this?
And you
Well,
want to go?
yeah, I'd agree. You certainly would want to. Now, whether they ask it and it just doesn't get reported, I don't know. But I mean, such a
Right.
logical statement
Do you think
that
it's
You would think that.
possible? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's just that maybe the point is that no one cared.
Well,
Well,
I
I
was
don't
That
know
gonna.
if
the
that's
people
true,
around.
and I do think that in many instances they're trying to minimize the malignancy. They're trying to make it benign because they don't want to face what it means, not just for the kid, for the child, but for the whole family. What kind of stain is it on them as parents? So they tend to think it's a passing phase that they'll get over, or they
Yeah.
turn away from it and just not think about the impact of it and how significant it is. I think you're going to see that more, and I think Jeffrey Dahmer's father's entire book was all about that, and he admits it. He kept
Yeah.
minimizing things because he did not want to
Yeah.
see what they meant.
And for some reason,
Mm.
Dr. Ransom, you went a little blurry. I'm not sure
No,
why, but I don't know if it's when you pull
I don't know
away.
either.
You might be trying to focus on you, but this might be a little two things. My husband did just post here. Thank you, husband. Some lawmakers in the state of New Jersey are trying to create a platform for businesses and organizations to easily identify animal abusers through an online animal abuse registry. And he also texted me, in 2014, the New York City Council passed the Animal Abuse Registration Act. This act requires any adult convicted of an animal abuse crime after October 2nd, 2014, and residing in New York City to contact the health department. They have to be added to the registry. They're prohibited from owning, possessing, residing with, having custody of, or intentionally engaging in any physical contact with an animal. The registration period lasts for 5 years after sentencing, or if incarcerated, for 5 years after release from incarceration, which is kind of concerning, the short term of that. But there is BARC. I had somebody from BARC on the show maybe it was this summer, I'm not even sure, but that's a program for adults who have committed certain types of neglect would be one, not so much like severe animal abuse, but it is a program they can go through. And there does seem to be some effect for some of these people, but they may not be hardcore, offenders. But and can therapists really talk people out of doing these things? Does treatment work? So that's the big question here. I know Dr. Ramsland has to jump off in a couple minutes, but that is the big question. Does treatment work? We've kind of touched on that, but what do you all think? Are you seeing hope in some of the literature at all? Or thoughts?
Well, since I'm blurred out, I'm not going to answer because I'm not a clinician myself. So I can't
I
tell
don't know
you.
what happened. Where you were fine, and then
I don't know. Nothing happened to my camera. I'm not sure.
That's so strange.
Yeah. I haven't
I
seen
think
any.
if you just turn it off and on again quickly, it'll
I know, but
deburr.
I'm actually about
She's
to
still
go.
anyway.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I
I'm
think
sorry,
this
Ann.
this might be a good point for me to take my leave and allow the other two to
You're
answer
literally
that
phasing out.
question.
Just
I think
take
the camera's
it.
telling me it's time for me to go.
Okay.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you
Well,
so
it won't
much.
be the same without you,
out.
Katherine.
Thank
right, thank you.
No.
Oh, now our view will change.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
So Ann, you were about to say something? Ann?
What?
Burgess. Okay,
What
Ann.
was I
Dr. Ann.
supposed
Yeah.
to say? Yeah. I was going to get into. I really was intrigued, with this assignment of trying to get into some of the literature and see, and was surprised at how many and you don't know where they're getting their information about what some of these adolescent school shooters have done, but anytime that it has some example and some description, I think is wonderful. Here's Nicholas Cruz. Now he's fairly recent. Back in he did the Parkland, Florida shooting in 2018, and it was known that he did in elementary school. Now that's when you're in fourth, fifth grade. He began shooting squirrels and chickens as a teenager, killed frogs, tried to maim a neighbor's baby pot-bellied pigs, and tried to crush animals trapped in rabbit holes. Now, that made me think of Ed Kemper, one of the serial killers who had, before he shot and killed his grandparents, they had given him a gun to go out and shoot little animals. So where do you draw the line if this is, something that's done? This is Montana or upper California, where it would be, but the grandmother would always admonish him for killing certain ones, and she would say, "Don't kill she didn't like him killing the birds, I think, and that it was okay if they killed a squirrel or something like that." Mm. But is that practice? I mean, I don't know whether, Gary, you've seen that in any of your, but it's really intriguing of where do you draw the line, and once you think they cross that line, how to intervene. I think that's what, Ann, you're trying to get at, and maybe some of your viewers of when should you be concerned, and if you are concerned, what would you do, and who do we have that can do it? I mean, how many of us know a therapist that has really in any way specialized with this? I don't know anybody that specialized with it, but I know that certainly therapists have been confronted with it.
Yeah.
I've certainly had over the years, I have had cases of people who tell me that they had been thinking, fantasizing about doing aggressive things, but that it helped that someone was kind to them. That on that particular day when they were ready to snap, somebody said hi to them or whatever, and it is very easy, especially when we conceptualize all these people as monstrous psychopaths, that they're kind of human with aberrations or a kind of amorality that isn't black and white, right? They can have friends and family and jobs and so forth and be a serial killer part of the time. And that's what's so horrifying about it, is that fragmentation, right? And so some of these people will say, it actually, it mattered to me that somebody was nice to me, and there have even been cases, for example, in mass shooters that I looked at in the database, where they would spare the people who had been kind to them almost as a reward. So you go around shooting and then, like, you skip over the one person who was nice to you, that kind of thing, right? And so that I think it's very difficult for us to understand the importance of stable relationships for these people. And and that's the other thing that's always interesting to me, is there are also serial killers who loved animals but hated people, who found the animals in their life to be very stabilizing and predictable. It was the people they loathed. And that's another interesting thing. I mean, I also want to make the point before it goes out of my head and I don't get to say it on this talk, is that I resent when people call very violent people animals, when they
I
say, "Oh,
don't
he
like
he was
that
just an
either.
animal."
No.
I don't really like that. I make that point on, like, the first page of the New Evil. I don't care for it because, as Dostoevsky famously said, that even if a tiger could nail a person up by his ears, he wouldn't. Only humans have that inventive cruelty.
Yeah.
And because it's all about symbolism and leveling the playing field and all that stuff. For animals, killing is a purely practical matter. And so that I think that comparison is an insult to some of these beautiful
I
creatures,
agree. That's
and
how I feel too.
so I think we have to be careful about that. But Anne, haven't you seen some that where the animals are actually a stabilizing force for them? They love animals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, one of the things you want to do especially with children who have perhaps been abused or neglected or whatever, is to give them a pet to have to care for, because the pet, if they're good to them, is going to respond. And so it can be a very positive, healing kind of a situation. So animals are very, very important in our lives and in people's lives. So,
There was a program
There's a
called
stable
Green Chimneys
relationship is the
that,
key. The stable relationship is what so many of these people are missing. That's the
absolutely.
whole idea. So that it's this thing that, it just will never not
Yeah.
love you, right? Like, for example, right now, a very hot case in the news, of course, is the Idaho murders. Ann and I have had a lot to say about those Idaho murders. And one of the questions that gets asked is, why was Kaylee's dog spared?
yeah.
Right. And I can't help but wonder if it's because, and this is, of course, this person is innocent until proven guilty, but I can't help but wonder if it's because a person who was so daunted by the unpredictability of relationships and people had a different attitude about animals. Remember, he was a
He's a
vegan.
vegan. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I always wondered, maybe animals were predictable to him and he could love them. I don't know, but it's interesting to think
Yeah.
about that the dog was spared, especially because it probably would have been pawing and barking in the middle of the murders,
Right.
and it was left. So that's really interesting, you know?
Well, I've done a murder case where the animal, the dog, was found locked in a bedroom. And that seems really odd until you realize that one of the who would do that, someone that the dog knew. And so when it came down to who was the suspect, was it the husband or was it a stranger? I think it became quite interesting. So the dog
Yeah,
or animals usually dogs can tell us an awful lot.
right.
I was going to go back to the original to see what your viewers think if they noticed it had fish and started noticing all these fish dying, what they would do with it. Would they look into it? Because the story of who this turned out to be, it turned out to be someone who had been adopted and then found out that his mother, when he found his birth mother, had kept his sister, but had given him up for adoption. And the story goes that that's when he began his killing. And he would kill, he used a gun and would kill couples that were parked in a car. And one psychological explanation of that was, and I'm the messenger here, I didn't say it, but he said that he was killing women so that they wouldn't have children that would not be love them or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So from the very little bit, oh well, just some fish are dying, all the way to this
Right.
particular serial killer's outcome was quite interesting. And I'm sure, Gary, you've got many stories that you can tell about how
Oh yeah.
animals were used in the
Right.
cases that you examined.
Well, I think it's important to remember that about 50%, it's estimated, about 50% of the serial killers of the type we mean, sexually sadistic, fantasy-oriented, ego-driven, motivated by a desire to dominate and control, manipulate, to level the playing field, about 50% of them are of the slick Ted Bundy type, right? That kind of, almost like attractive, manipulative, kind of suave, glib kind of. But the other 50% are of the schizoid type. They're more odd, the kind of person that the whole neighborhood would say was weird, isolative, peculiar, a little disorganized, etc. And those people are the ones who tend to be more interested intellectually in cruelty. It's not so much sadistic as it is experimenting with animals or people to see what's inside of them. Kemper was something like that. Kemper was very curious about what was inside of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Anne could certainly talk about that, but you're talking about a person who would talk about it like we would say, I just want to see what happens. It's almost like the way some offenders talk about it is they'll say, I just don't feel very much, and I want to see what it takes to
Yep.
make a person feel. How
Yeah.
much pain do they need before they'll feel something? Because no matter what I went through, I never felt anything. It's a
Yeah.
kind of a strange experimentation, and they see themselves as doing this to animals, sometimes to be cruel, but it's sometimes just to kind of see things like what they'll do, how they escape, what sounds
Mm-hmm.
they make, what happens to them when you touch them with fire, what's inside their bodies, what happens if you keep their body parts, etc. What happens when you eat them? There have been some schizoid, kind of bizarre, more bizarre serial killers that will eat animals. For example, Richard Chase, who was a schizophrenic serial killer, had the belief that aliens were transmitting rays to his blood and putting powder inside his blood. So he needed to eat, suck the blood of rabbits, cows, and other things by biting into them, and then
Yeah.
eventually started to do it to people, and then killed several people. He was actually sort of caught by a friend of Anne's, and certainly a hero of mine. It was a Hazelwood case, wasn't it, Anne?
Yep. Roy
Yeah,
Hazelwood.
yeah. And who wrote about it in a wonderful book called "We Who Fight Monsters."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think what I really want to drive home is the idea that we cannot paint with a broad brush that people who abuse animals are all of that on that sort of trajectory towards
Right.
traditional serial killing. There, you have to go into an individual case and determine the meaning of it.
Right.
But I think it would be pretty safe to say that if you have a child who is abusing animals, you may want someone to go in and find out why, because some of them are abused. I recently had to look at a case, and there'll be no identifying information, and I'm going to change this slightly. But I was asked about a case that had happened some time ago of someone who had put an object inside of a dog, rectally inside of a dog, and when the person was questioned, they admitted that that had happened to them in childhood, that they had been a victim of parental abuse. And it was a
Yeah.
way of sort of they knew they experimented with that kind of a thing, but they weren't violent. They were abused.
Yeah.
And I think again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for someone to just ask what this behavior is about. I mean, somebody had to find the hanging animals at the Heidnik yard,
Yeah.
and people saw that the father was abusing him. So, I mean, and what you say, it's like a failure
Yeah.
of the
And it's a
system.
very simple question you can say is, what are you thinking when you do that? Or what does that mean? I think that is just a basic kind of or draw a picture if they're not terribly verbal and they're very young, see what they can draw for pictures. I see that one of these, Luke Woodham, now he was out of Mississippi
Mhm.
and he kept a journal. Now that journal, I would be
Oh
very
yeah.
important to look at and to see. And in the journal, he evidently said that he had beaten his dog Sparkle with a club, doused her with lighter fluid, and set her on
Yes.
fire and threw her in a pond.
Mm.
Now
Mhm.
that's very specific,
Very
so
specific.
I wonder, I'm just
Sounds like
thinking,
practice, Anne, for
yeah,
for eventually playing that out with a person. Michael
oh,
Stone and a lot of other people always thought that cats were a favored animal victim for serial killers because of their resemblance to females. Michael Stone always thought that the face of a cat was very feminine, and that as a
my
consequence that
kitty's
they were
getting
a
back here.
common object of
Don't listen to
hostility.
you.
It's an interesting idea. It's an old idea, but it's interesting because I think one of the questions I cannot get an answer on from the literature, and anyone who knows me knows this is like a Dr. Brucato question. It bothers me. I don't know the answer. Is I don't know statistically what the most common animals are that are tortured by serial killers. I can't answer that, so I want to know. And but it certainly looks like it's the typical animals that would be kept in a house. But cats, dogs,
that's
and
yeah. They're easier to,
rabbits,
I would think,
birds, things
control
like that.
than
But it
dog.
would be interesting to see, yeah, if
Yeah,
like
yeah,
Dahmer certainly went beyond and was skinning, coyote, things like that, dogs, and other kind of animals, things that you could get out in the wild. Or he would keep the skulls that he found in the wilderness and sort of display
yeah.
them. But I think it's an interesting question, and maybe we'll be the people to study it.
Do you think that maybe to some extent it's just because of availability and like not getting caught, or just because of how easy it is, it might actually be insects and bugs they find outside and things like that could be maybe,
Yes, right. That's a
um
good point.
but you do hear a lot
Yeah.
about
Like using a
cats.
magnifying glass, yeah, to burn
Yeah.
them with a
Yeah.
magnifying glass. But
Yeah.
a lot of kids do things like that. It makes
Yeah.
them feel powerful.
See that, and that's, I was going to ask you, two things. One, you mentioned, if people would just, if someone would have just asked, this might be a little controversial, but there's some studies, right, that show that this is potentially hereditary. There's some genetics possibly going on, and with these callous, unemotional traits, and maybe that puts them at risk of not having anybody ask because maybe possibly they're not, the parent might not be, if they're callous and unemotional themselves, they're not reacting to these things the way that maybe others would. That
And how do we know if it's genetic or if it's just that the personality traits of the people that you're exposed to cause you to sort of mimic what you're seeing
right.
around you?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's necessarily genetic or just picked up, monkey see, monkey do kind of a thing. But I mean, wouldn't you say, and we wouldn't be able to tell the etiology of it from something like that?
Yeah, I think yeah, trying to get into etiology is way, way far down the road to any of this. You haven't even gotten basic statistics. I think some of Dr. Picato's questions need to be answered first, and
Yeah.
then you could come up with
Yeah.
hypotheses.
Right.
Do you
But I
think that?
was horrified by. Oh, go ahead, Ann, please.
Well, no, I was just curious. Do you think that there's any other behaviors, peripheral behaviors, not animal abuse? Like, what kinds of things would people maybe if they were really looking out, and this might not even be family members, it might be teachers, whatever, that might indicate that there's a problem in this kind of realm. Red flags.
It's a great question for Anne, and about antecedents to
Yeah.
violence beyond animal abuse. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
number of them.
Right. Well, I think anything that shows negative, harmful, painful kinds of even verbally statements, how are people talked about or treated or something would certainly be something that you might want to follow up on. And, I really do think that a famous psychiatrist once said, who knows their children best? And I think mothers do. And mothers maybe know more than they will ever tell. But there's got to be some way of helping mothers to talk about their concerns about their children. And that might be one way. Mothers group or something like that. There's certainly got to be. I would love to have talked on some of our serial killers with the mothers of them. We talked with a few of them, but
Oh yeah.
it would be very revealing, I think. And look at how many killed their mother. I mean, that's the other really scary thing. We just did a study of elder Indians where sons and grandsons had killed their mother, their grandmother. So something goes way back.
Do you, in
Well,
talking
I
to,
think violent pornography, I think, is very important to look for. I have found that
Absolutely.
in adolescents who,
Yeah.
who are budding serial offenders, one of the first telltale signs is that fantasy drives them to look for visual depictions of people being abused, so
Yeah.
forth. For example, in the Rex Heuermann case, the accused Gilgo Beach killer, his search history contained things like children that had been beaten. There was sort of violent pornography, sexual assault, women, girls crying, being sexually all mixed up, right? Imagine bouncing back and forth between looking at pornography and images of people being beaten or crying. I mean, so that I think what you want to look for is signs that the fantasy life is demonstrating a fusion between violence and sex, that's an outlet expression of violence. Because what I think is, my sense is that before the discovery of sex as that outlet, animals are a pretty common one. It's almost as if, like, you realize you could go out and do it to women, or if you're a male offender, because they tend to be heterosexual offenders targeting females, although there are certainly homosexual serial killers that target men. Virtually no women, or very few. You could count on a couple of hands who commit sexual homicide repetitively. But it does seem that there's this kind of process of needing more and more cruelty, more and more of a thrill, and the wide scale availability of violent pornography is a very dangerous um, it's a very dangerous thing. It gets very addictive, and then it gets boring because you've seen it all, and then you need something more horrifying and more horrifying, just like what would happen with a drug, which is not enough for you anymore. And this is what I'm just writing about it with Anne, for a book we're doing on escalation. And I think that process of escalation is often about that, of needing more and more of a thrill. And wouldn't you say that offenders talk to you about that
Yes, they do.
when you?
They're aware of it. There's no secret to them. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
it does look like there's a study that I don't know. My husband is texting me instead of putting it in the chat, but this is in one study of family.
Indispensable. He's
Like trying to
indispensable.
look everywhere at the same time.
I can keep up with him there, Anne.
um, in one survey, 71% of domestic violent victims reported their abuser also targeted pets. Researchers have found that pet abuse had occurred in 88% of families under supervision for physical abuse. And every 60 seconds, one animal suffers abuse. Close to 65% of all abused animals are dogs.
There you go, Anne. There's your answer. Dogs, are they
Yeah.
the preferred
It's
animal?
very good that you found that. I would like to see the study, and it would be interesting to see the sample size and if it's anything we could replicate. But it's interesting. I mean, there's always something to build on in previous research, and it might even be interesting to see who the authors are. That's how we build our network of collaborators. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
anybody that's interested in that question is a friend of ours. That's our
Yeah.
kind of topic.
The Animal Legal
So
Defense
yeah.
Fund is very up on these things, and probably they have a lot of information. I'm sure the Animal Legal Defense Fund. They've been on this show
Yeah.
actually before, but this information is coming from the Humane Society site. It does say most often reported are dogs, cats, horses, and livestock. And factory farming,
Wow.
that's a whole other issue.
Horses, that's extreme. And would you have expected horses on that list of most common?
Well, I'm with you. What sample are they using that has a horse that they can, you know, is
I'm curious about the data. Yeah, like
Hmm.
Catherine said, we got to see the data.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that one was from
You
the
have to divide
Humane
it into
Society.
small animals and then large animals. I think that's
That may
Right.
be also
what
important.
I would
Yeah.
do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know
Well,
one question and I don't want to keep you guys too much longer. I know that we wanted to get you out of here at a certain time, but wondering, what is it like to do what you do? What's
Oh, I
mhm.
teach. What is it
And
like to teach?
which part of it do you mean? We
Well,
do
I
so
think
many
I
things.
mean more more the interaction that you have with individuals, and maybe not so much currently, I don't know, but like, having to have had conversations with people about these things directly, who have done these kinds of acts.
Well, it depends on how old they are and what they're in for. If they're, say, a convicted offender, serial killer, like
Yeah.
we've written about, yes, that's always interesting to see if they'll be able to talk about it or volunteer it. If you're working with a group of children, young people, youth, that's a whole different matter. But to me, it's learning and it's adding to a knowledge base because there isn't, especially in this, there isn't that much out there. I think it's
Hmm.
really, really important. I wish that we had asked that for all of our 36 serial killers. We only have some of that information, hearsay, if you will, from prior. So, and I don't always like to do that. I like to have some firsthand information. But I don't know. Gary had the same thing in his mass murderers. You had to rely on a lot of records, and great if they had
Right.
included it in a intake, but they all didn't ask the right questions. I'm sure
I
you
mean,
find.
it was 119 years of data. So
Yeah,
it depended on when the cases,
sure.
stemmed from. I mean, what period? I mean, media reports are all you have sometimes, and
Yeah,
you know how the media is with accuracy. You need to find multiple reports that say the same thing. For example, a newspaper could report on a mass murder the day it happened and say 4 people were killed. But then 2 days later, it's 6 people because more
sure.
people have expired in the hospital. The facts change, it's a moving, thing. Well, my answer to that is that I always try to bear in mind that it's sort of the way that a surgeon or a nurse, I mean, Anne is a nurse, that has to encounter blood and gore and terrible things in the interest of saving a life. That you just sort of go through it to get to what you need, because what we always have to bear in mind is this work we're doing ultimately informs what law enforcement does and what emergency personnel do and how you know people profile and conceptualize offenders and go out and stop them. And the ultimate goal of it is to spare victims, whether they're human or animal or victims. And for Anne and for me and certainly for Catherine, the emphasis is really always on that. I think we
Hmm.
we bristle with a kind of a horror and irritation at the emphasis that the public places on finding the offenders interesting. I mean, the reality is that they are of secondary, if any, importance in the story. We see them essentially as informational sources to figure out how to stop this from happening
Yeah.
to people. That's
Yeah.
really what it is. So that, and I think I always have to bear that in mind. And then I think to give a little bit more of a complicated response, sometimes what's difficult about it is you go in expecting to encounter a kind of a diabolical colossus of evil. And instead, what you find is a kind of a pathetic, small human that is sometimes able to attach to you very exaggeratedly or is seeking attention pathetically. And sometimes you even like them, and then you leave feeling horrible that you like them so much and you don't know why,
Yeah.
because there is a humanity in there. I have to tell
Yeah.
you, there are a few of them. I have encountered some offenders that are so into this stuff day in and day out that you walk away from them and there is an almost foreboding kind of feeling of evil, that kind of thing. But most of them are pretty fragmented and pretty pathetic, I have to tell you.
Mhm.
And basically what it boils down to is because of their needs or their mood or their fantasy or whatever, they have decided that they were entitled to pluck somebody's kid or an animal or somebody's friend or whatever out of the world. And we just don't want that to happen to anybody else. That's really
Mhm.
what this is about.
Mhm.
And so it's difficult work. I mean, we're human beings. We see horrible things. But I think we take a clinical approach. If we have to be clinical and detached or we won't get anywhere. What'd you
Mhm.
say, Ann? I mean, it's very
Right.
doctor-like.
Yeah.
You
You
just,
have to be able to. Yeah. You'd have to
you
be
won't be
able.
able to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is. So,
Mhm. Well, I
well, I hope this
understand
was
that.
interesting. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very
Thank
interesting.
you.
I got into things I wouldn't normally get into. So
Well,
certainly going to put
yeah,
that on the list to always check. It should be on ACEs, I think. You know.
wonderful. We really appreciate everyone in the chat is just saying how much they appreciate you talking about this, and I think it is a conversation that's important, and like we talked about, the registry, things like that. We need to do more for animals and protecting them, but getting to the root of this is so important. And I really want to thank you first of all for being here, and also maybe just to end on a fun note, what's your favorite animal?
Oh, dogs are my
Dogs.
favorite. Yeah.
oh,
Gary, what are yours?
I have a soft spot for a number of animals. I've always been a very big lover of elephants. I'm
Elephant.
crazy about
Oh,
Oh,
they're
elephants.
yeah.
I'm a very big lover of any large cat,
Mm-hmm.
especially panthers and jaguars and
yeah. Well, they're
lions and
beautiful.
so forth, the tigers especially.
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
I have a real soft spot for whales. I love
Oh,
them.
they're amazing.
I'm a big marine animal
Oh,
guy, but
okay.
but whales in general, they just fascinate me. I mean, there's something about them so extraordinary. You ever
Yeah.
see a whale come out of the water? You never forget it.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
majestic, but I do want to say before we end, I hope that some of the people viewing will consider pet adoption. Good people in good homes have to remember that there is just a whole world of animals that are strays and, that are born in, mills and all this kind of stuff. And they're so adorable. Go look at them. You'll fall in love. You know, they'll become the center of your life.
Yeah.
And I think if you have a heart big enough for it, I mean, because it's really tragic when you think about that. Some of these places won't keep an animal forever,
No.
and you kind of give it a life, you give it hope, and so if you have it in your heart, I really think it's important. I know everybody here would echo that, but
Yeah. Well, and
but
especially now, a lot of them are turning up now. People are bringing them to the shelters because they adopted them during COVID, working from home. Now they're getting called back to the office, and the shelters are now getting overrun with
Mhm.
animals being sent back. So that's a very important message. Thank you for bringing that up.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
All right, well, it was so nice to be invited.
Thank
Yes, it was
you.
a good, very good evening. Thank you very much, Anne.
It was an honor to
Yeah,
have
gave
you
us a lot
here.
to think about. We have a lot
Yeah,
to think about in our
yeah,
research.
Yeah,
yeah.
I can't wait to hear about that down the road. Absolutely. So thank you so much. It was an honor to
Yeah.
have you, and everyone in the chat, thank you, and everyone watching the replay. If you do think of it, please like, subscribe. I always forget to say that, and share. And
Okay.
to everyone out there, God bless and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.